My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. I'm so pleased to welcome Joe Kinnaird back onto the podcast. He's just released his first book. We've done an episode about that, so if you haven't gone back and listened to that, please do. But there's one chapter in the book that's on questioning. This is also a topic that he spoke about at Strictly, and I was lucky enough to see that talk, and it was just so brilliant that I just wanted him to come back on the podcast and talk a little bit about questioning. So welcome back, Joe.
Thank you, Louisa. It's a pleasure to be back.
And has it been weird knowing that your book is out there in the world and people are reading it?
Yeah, it's a very proud feeling, seeing all of that hard work over the years come to fruition. A very proud feeling, very surreal, and just really amazing personal and professional accomplishment. And I just hope it helps many RE teachers around the country.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. So we're here to talk about questioning, and let's just start with this idea of like why questioning is important, maybe generally, but specifically also to our subject.
I think there's lots of reasons for it. I think in many respects, we take it for granted. It's one of the staple features of a teacher's toolkit. We explain, we model, we give feedback. But I think questioning is one of the most dominant methods of classroom instruction. I like to see it as the heartbeat of the classroom. And research indicates that 40% of classroom time is spent asking questions. And so, asking questions is pivotal to pupil achievement. I often think that not just RE teachers, but generally all classroom teachers will make great chat show hosts. We're really good.
Or podcast hosts.
Well, podcast hosts. Yeah, they'd be great at it because, they're really good at, listening to the responses of students and posing questions that are appropriately targeted and can elicit more from students, help to clarify something or get them to, further elaborate upon a point. And to go back to your point about how it relates to RE, I think, it dates back to Socrates, doesn't it? Humans love to ask questions. We look to seek answers to questions and contemplate questions. And so I think it's right at the very heart of RE. And therefore, I wanted to do a session at Strictly about questioning and just thinking, how can we, build upon what we already do and try and think about some things that we're not considered as much.
You're absolutely right. Like it really is the sort of the heartbeat of like who we are as humans as well, in terms of that's how we have been curious and learnt about the world and evolved as people. And if you look at babies, if you look at children, the sort of questions, they're constantly questioning and they quite often ask those why questions. So it seems to be kind of what makes us human is our need to be curious and ask questions and find out about the world. And I also think you're right that, I'm really surprised that 40% of classroom time is asking questions. And it makes me think that maybe how effective is that questioning? Yeah. How useful is it? Is there ways that, as you say, we can tighten up that skill to make it more effective in the classroom? What kind of questions should we be asking? But you're also right in that actually we look at the history of our subject, we go right back into sort of ancient Greek and we look at the beginning of philosophy and we look at Socrates and all those kind of people. That's where, it was kind of almost formalized, that sort of Socratic dialogue and asking questions. So, yeah, I think that's really interesting. Let's then talk about, we talked a bit about how effective our questions are. What are some of the barriers to effective questioning in the RE classroom?
I think there's quite a few barriers. I think one is pupils feeling shy. Some students may not feel comfortable answering questions because they're naturally quiet. They don't want the spotlight on them, and sometimes pupils hide away from engaging in the questioning culture we want in the classroom. I think sometimes pupils already know it. Just going back to what I previously mentioned, 40% of classroom time approximately is spent asking questions, but that doesn't necessarily indicate quality questioning. So sometimes students might get disengaged because they already know the answer. Often as well, sometimes might avoid participating because they don't enjoy or value the subject. And I think that's something that's, we experience in our subject. I think that's true of any subject, really. If students don't see the value of it or they don't enjoy it, they can switch off. I think there's a couple of social factors as well. There's the fear of failure. A lot of our students are really conscientious. They don't want to get the answer incorrect. So they may opt out of questioning because they don't want to get it wrong. The default is I don't know, or shrug of the shoulders. There's also that fear of peer pressure as well. Students and adults fear embarrassment. No one wants to get something wrong, and often the classroom is a social space, and so the way a student answers a question or asks a question can be a big factor in how they're perceived by others, which I think makes a difference. As well, with our subject, it's the context sometimes of what we're looking at. We deal with big metaphysical questions. We deal with incredibly sensitive topics like abortion and euthanasia. And these topics might sometimes unsettle students, and they don't want to participate for that reason as well.
So it's so interesting because actually I don't know how many of those we consciously think about, particularly the questions being too easy, because I think that actually if they're easy, the students disengage and they can't be bothered to answer it because it's not, you haven't got that desirable difficulty in the type of question. And so you've got to get that balance right between a question that's challenging and hard and is engaging, but not so hard that the kids then are put off answering because they haven't got a clue what you're talking about. And so that takes a lot of skill, I think. That you're right to talk about that sort of, just embarrassment or just feeling a little bit anxious about getting it wrong or, in front of peers and things like that. Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. And also just that sort of trauma-informed way of thinking about, I think sometimes we could be a bit flippant because we're talking about these things all the time and maybe have done for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that to talk about quite sensitive topics with young people, maybe this is the first time they've talked about it. We really need to have an awareness that some of these things are quite difficult to talk about. I think,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
some really helpful things there. So one sort of technique that I think is used in classrooms in order to ensure that students are engaged is cold calling.
Mm.
So this is when we pick on somebody to ask. If we do that effectively, it can be good, but there's ways of doing it that it's wrong. Just talk to us about sort of your tips for cold calling.
Yeah, firstly, I hate the term. Is it's that idea of like feeling like we're going to catch students out,
Yeah.
and if I go back to when I was a student, if I was in the class, I hate the idea that a teacher could pick on me at any moment,
Yes.
and so I don't like the term
Yeah.
or the name. I'd call it warm calling if possible, or something else. But I do think it's a strategy that I look to, and many teachers look to incorporate to try and increase the participation ratio in the classroom, so that when you do the same few students, and the way it works is that you select the volunteer for the answer to the question as opposed to going to a hands up. First thing that I do if I'm teaching a new class is I maybe might explain the rationale, for why I'm wanting to do it. And I think that can help to build the trust and engagement students. And so I might, talk about, in our lessons, I don't always want you to put your hands up. Your hands up, it doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to go to you. I want everyone to think deeply about the question that I'm asking. And then I might choose someone to answer the question. And just sharing this because all of your ideas matter to me, and we can hearing from different views, even if your answer isn't perfect. And so if I call your name when I pose the question, it's because I'm genuinely interested in what you think, and I want to hear what you think so I can help you in your understanding of the material. And so it's about, firstly, I think, explaining the rationale. I also think, just building upon what we were talking about earlier, I think it's really important for RE teachers and just generally classroom teachers to think about when best to use it. Really personal nature to RE that can make cold calling, or warm calling, as I'll call it, more challenging. And so, if we're talking about morality, identity, belief, these are really personal, emotionally charged topics for people and for young people. And therefore, some students may feel reluctant to share them publicly. So I think really carefully about when we use it. So for me, I feel most comfortable using it if I'm asking like factual questions or knowledge recall questions about a concept. I might allow students to pass or contribute later if the question is slightly of a personal nature. And I think also as well, like using supportive language with students, throughout the lesson, but also in this context, phrases like, there's no one right answer. I'd love to hear what you think, things like that. I think to get really into the minutiae of it, it's not only the question you pose and who you pose it to, it's like when you say the name of the person, when you say the name of the student. So say, for instance, if I pose a question first, all the students in the class will still be thinking. Then if I say the name at the end, then I've gone to my student. Right. If I said the name of the student first and then posed the question, that's the opportunity for the rest of the class to switch off. So I think firstly, ask the question before saying the name. And then, and this is the part that every teacher feels uncomfortable with, is when you pose a question, just wait a few seconds, embrace the awkwardness and then put the name of the student, because giving that wait time allows the students to actually think about the question.
Yes. Yes.
We're looking at big things in the RE classroom, and posing a big question to a student, to a class, and then asking a student for their response within a second, 2 seconds. We're asking a lot of some kids sometimes. So I think just giving some wait time before saying the name, I think is another really helpful strategy.
And I think you're absolutely right. We feel uncomfortable doing it. But I'm talking from someone who's neurodiverse. If you have ADHD, what that means is that your neuroprocessors are slow.
Mm,
So it takes you a lot of time to process the question, find the right answer,
mm,
and then be able to speak. And so actually in any activity, whether it's think, pair, share, or whether it's like, posing questions, I totally, totally support that real focus on the gap, on the silence, on the thinking time. And actually sometimes taking that a step further, and that here's the question. I want everyone to think about it, write down your answers on a whiteboard. And then actually when you ask the question to a particular person, they've got that message, they've got that on in front of them on a whiteboard. And actually that can really support. And I think as you were speaking, the other thing I was really thinking about is your relationships with the student is important, and your knowledge of the students is important. That you have to know who you can warm call, who you can't, what type of questions suit different learners,
mm.
that actually these have to be thought about and planned beforehand before you go in. So, and I think you're right, the type of questions you ask using this technique is
Mm.
really significant. So don't ask your really deep personal questions, ask the kind of factual stuff. I think that's really, really, really good advice. Thank you for that. So let's move on now to sort of different types of questions, or sort of the purpose for questions. So I think we have to realize that not all questioning is the same, and there's different types of questioning for different purposes. And you kind of hinted there that of some of those differences, but let's explore that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to what you said earlier about, planning questions in advance. And sometimes we might do that as part of our practice, but I think it's that reflection of what types of, what am I wanting students to be thinking about when I pose a question? So it could be a type of question that's asking for clarification, where I want them to really specify the meaning of a term. So I might ask a question like, oh, can you say more about that? Or what do you mean by the term sacred? Or can you give me an example from the text to support that? It could be a type of question that's asking them to justify their response more. So asking them to provide evidence. So it could be, what evidence from the Bible could you use to support this position? We could also ask questions that help to challenge students. So could get them to consider other views or question assumptions. So I think this works well when you're looking at sensitive topics, but it might be like a question like, is it always true or just in some cases? Does this belief still apply today? So I think those types of questions can help to get students think about alternative perspectives. We might also want to ask questions that get students to expand their thinking further, questions that get them to elaborate. That might be examples of like, can you tell me more about that? What are the teachings linked to this? So I think it's just opening up the scope of what types of questions exist out there, and thinking about, different times in your lessons, what types of questions are best to ask.
And I think also being mindful that these have to be planned. So you've got to very clearly plan what questions you're going to ask at what. So if you're chunking your lessons, you're giving your like really explicit explanations, what questions do you need to ask at this point? So you've kind of got that. You're then moving on to the type of question that you're going to ask. And then you're thinking about who you're going to ask those questions to. And I think that questioning has to be very deliberate in order for it to be effective. There's something that you've said before. I can't remember if I read it in your book or whether you said it strictly about the power of the word might. So
Yeah.
if you're asking a question, how might somebody like do this, or why might somebody disagree with you? The power of using that word, what that does is it allows the child to get it wrong.
Yeah.
So if you say how do, then it
Mm,
suggests that there is a right or wrong, and that goes back to that, the thing we were saying earlier about people feeling a bit insecure about asking questions. One way of mitigating against that is use that word might. So how might a Christian respond to this? Or why might somebody disagree with you? Or what might a different perspective be? Because that becomes low threat,
yeah.
even if the question is high challenge. And I think that phrase, like low threat, high challenge, is how can you ask really good questions in a way that doesn't freak the kid out, essentially, is what it is, isn't it? Yeah. I think that's great.
And
You've
also,
talked, go on, yeah.
but also it opens up the recognition that there's multiple answers to some questions,
Yes.
and so I think that's important. With that word "might," it lowers the risk, but
Mm.
also gets them to recognize that there isn't one set response to certain questions that we look at in our culture.
So actually, you then might pair it with the word some. So how
Yeah,
might some Christians respond to that? So again, you're kind of building in that sense of diversity, the fact that there is, plural ideas, that it doesn't matter if you have a go and get it wrong. It's got that low threat. So it's quite simple in some ways, but actually really powerful if you really think about the words that you're trying to use. You've talked a little bit there about how to sort of help your students to develop their answers by saying something like, what Bible verse could you use? Or can you add a keyword to that? What are some of the other techniques that you use to kind of help students to develop their answers to your questions?
there's one in one of the walkthroughs books called "Say It Again Better," where
Yeah.
we get students to develop the quality of their verbal response. Sometimes students will offer like a half-formed answer for a variety of reasons, some of which we spoke about, like in the barriers. I can't be bothered, not so sure. And so I think sometimes when we get that half-formed response, that the natural inclination of the teachers to almost like round up their answer
Yes.
and top it up to what we want, because often when we ask a question, we've got the answer in our head that we want, and sometimes we'll get the half-formed answer from the student and we'll think, oh, we'll accept that, I'll just top it up, and we can move on. But
Yes.
I think it's trying to get them to give um the answer you want, and so I think when they give a half-formed answer, firstly acknowledge it and praise it where you can, and then use questioning to try and elicit the response you want. So I think that, like, the example I use in the book is, if a student says Hindus believe you come back after you die, I might respond by saying, right, you're on the right track. I praise the positive bit, and then say, can you say it again using terms which a Hindu may use? And then hopefully, fingers crossed, they'd say Hindus believe in reincarnation, and then offer me a definition of that term. I'm pushing them towards the right answer, praise it's correct, and then using a question that is encouraging them to elaborate a little bit further. If they don't do that, then I might pose the question to the rest of the class, but tell that student I'm coming back to you. So
Yes.
you need to make sure you're listening carefully. And one of those two techniques can help develop
Yeah.
their.
And actually, that leads really nicely on to my next question, which is a very common
Mm,
experience in the classroom is a kid says, I don't know.
yeah, the
And
three
I
words.
think that having a few techniques up your sleeve to deal with that, because it might be that they genuinely don't know. So I think we almost have to assume that they genuinely don't know.
Yeah,
It's possible that they just can't be bothered. So that is a possibility. So But I think if we think that, then if we think, oh, they're just being lazy, they can't be bothered, I think the way that we then approach that would probably be wrong. If we assume they don't know, what techniques can we use to help them formulate an answer so they are not let off and
Yeah.
that they don't then are encouraged to use don't know as a kind of avoidance technique?
I think the first one is something I hadn't thought of. And then I saw something online that Adam Boxer shared, and he said, firstly, check if they were listening.
Yeah.
So often, I pose a question and they say, I don't know, and then ask them to repeat the question back to you just to
Yes.
see if they were listening.
Yeah.
And it might just be that they just weren't thinking.
Yeah.
And so I think, firstly, check they were listening, get them to say the question back. If they weren't listening, you can pose the question to them and see what you get.
Yeah.
Then, if they were listening and we still get, I don't know, then there's various things we can look to do. I think the first thing is, we don't want them to opt out. And so I think it might be, just going back to what we spoke about previously, about giving them more waiting time. So if the student says, I don't know, you might, as the first part of your response, give them a little guide of like, we were looking at this in our last lesson, different interpretations of the creation story. I'm going to come back to you. Whilst you're thinking, I'm going to ask a different question to another student and take an answer from a different student and then say, right, Ryan, I'm coming back to you. Have you got a better answer that you can share with me? That can work well. Alongside that, you can also get you can pose the same question to the rest of the class and get that student to listen. Then when you hear the answer you want, go back to that first student and get them to say the answer back. We can also try the method that you mentioned earlier about making the question less high stakes. I think that can sometimes help. So, you know, changing a question from why do we suffer, so why might we suffer, lowers the stakes significantly. Or if you're like modeling and you're, breaking down the key features of paragraph, changing the question from what is the best way we can improve this paragraph to in what ways might we improve this paragraph. Making way plural, indicates there's a range of responses. So the student might be more likely to offer a response because there's less risk of getting it wrong. And finally, if they say, I don't know, you could look to explore what they do know.
Yeah.
You pose a question, student says, I don't know. And then you could say to student, right, tell me something about the question which you do know, and then use that response from the student to then pose some subsequent questions that can get you towards the answer that you want. Because the student will know something. It might be shallow in depth, or there might be some misconception, but they will know something that you can draw upon to then prompt further questioning to hopefully get you towards the answer of the initial question you posed.
It's so helpful, isn't it? So I think like in the first instant then, just to go, did you hear the question? If they didn't, I'm just begging you, please don't be cross with them.
Yeah.
So what happens in my brain when you have an ADHD brain is it shuts down momentarily and you don't realize. So you think you're really concentrating, but then you've completely missed something. You weren't conscious. It's just sometimes your brain gets a bit overloaded or overwhelmed and it just kind of almost powers down to kind of save a bit of battery.
Mm,
You're not consciously not listening, or if you have ADHD, you get easily distracted. So you could be listening to the teacher, someone coughs,
mm,
you're momentarily distracted by the cough, and then you've missed what the teacher said. So
mm,
don't assume if someone's not listening that it's a disciplinary thing. Just simply repeat the question. Go, don't worry about that. Here's the question again.
mm,
That's your first step. Make sure they've heard the question. If they're saying, I don't know the answer, just go, is there anything in the answer that you do know? Or you prompt them, you signpost them. Do you remember last week when we were listening about that? Or look on the board, look at the keywords for this lesson. Is there anything there that might help you? Bounce technique is what you're saying. So actually, if they genuinely don't know, you don't force the issue because that will be uncomfortable for everybody. Say, I'm going to go to a couple more students. I want you to listen, and then I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to ask you the same question so you can see, I can see whether you've understood something.
mm.
So it's always about not letting them off the hook, but really helping them and empowering them in a really kind, sensitive way
Yeah.
to have a go.
Yeah.
I think it's really important.
I think a lot of it, back to what you're saying earlier about the teacher student relationship and that relationship is born out of a lot of things, and, having, high expectations for students, really strong subject knowledge, showing that you care. And I think that alongside other factors, students can buy into that questioning culture which we promote in our classroom.
Yeah. And I think actually something you've said a couple of times, and I haven't necessarily picked up on it, but actually I think it's really powerful, is telling them why you're doing this thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's because I think sometimes students have, preconceived beliefs or ideas about things that you're trying to catch them out, or you're trying to like test them, and it immediately sort of puts them into that slightly anxious state of mind, and their sort of nervous system is a bit. But if you're going, I'm genuinely interested in what you think, I need to know that I've taught you this right, so I need to check that you've kind of that I've explained it well, so I'm going to ask you a few questions to check your understanding. If you're speaking through what you're doing and why you're doing it and the rationale for it, you're taking the kids with you, and it's not just kind of. And I think this is why maybe the kind of term cold calling
Mm,
you find unhelpful, because actually nothing should be cold, nothing should
yeah.
be a shock, nothing should be extreme. You have to kind of warm them up and warm their brains up and have that relationship with them and know your students for that questioning to land and to be effective.
Yeah, and I think it becomes part of like the predictability of the classroom that, students come in and they know the teacher is going to explain some ideas really well. They're going to model things really well. They're going to give feedback on X and Y. And also they're going to ask lots of questions to lots of students to check their understanding, have some discussion, and the same is going to happen the next lesson. And that consistency helps build that sort of that culture that we want, of like questions which the teacher asks, we could probably talk about later, like questions which the teacher asks, the students ask the teacher, but also students ask of each other. So seeing questioning is not actually just something which the teacher does, but also the students do in response to the teacher and in response to each other. I think that's the utopian vision of the classroom that we want.
100%. And actually, I'm going to come back to something you've said, which is, questioning in a classroom isn't just you asking questions of the
Mm,
students, it's the questions they ask you and each other. And we're going to talk about what makes a good question later. Something else, though, is this idea of metacognitive questions. What
mm.
do we mean by that? And what does that look like in the classroom?
Well, I think metacognitive questions could probably best defined as like, or metacognition can best be defined as like thinking about thinking. And so if we're asking metacognitive questions, we're asking students questions which are getting them to explore the thinking or the process behind what they've said or what work they've done, that enable them to be more independent and more reflective about their work and sort of break it down as such. I think there's various ways it probably lends itself well to RE. If like one example I give in the book is like if you've done like a Diamond 9 style activity, where students been looking at a range of responses to a question, and they've ranked them according to which they most agree and disagree, getting them to posing questions to them like, why do you think that was the most important reason? Um, how did you decide which argument? Why did you think this was a weak argument? So putting them in a thinking state where they're having to reflect on the decisions that they've made. It can also work well, like when you're looking at interpretation of scripture or looking at scholarship in the classroom. If they've spent some time looking at different interpretations of a text, you could ask questions like, what made you think of that? Where did the idea come from? How did your own worldview or your own positionality affect the way you interpreted it? It can also lend itself well, I think, to personal reflections. We've had a lot of time thinking about personal knowledge, and I think there's a huge crossover with metacognitive questions and developing personal knowledge. Getting students to think about questions like, what are the similarities between your view and the views of a religious believer on this issue? Um, the learning more about Islamic views on the afterlife, has your perspective changed? How did are the differences between your view on forgiveness and the view of Christians, which we've looked at in this lesson? Not just with ideas as well, not just with like the substantive knowledge we look at in the classroom. We can also do with modeling. If you're looking at exemplar work, metacognitive questions help to like get students thinking about the thinking of writing. So why did I choose to start my sentence like this? What's a better word or phrase I could use here? Or is there another way we could explain this extract? So there's various ways that we could look to use cognitive questions in the classroom.
So essentially what you're doing is you're asking them questions about how they're answering the question
Yes.
in
Yeah.
order sort of to deepen their thinking, but also to then improve the quality of their answers.
Yes.
Can I just, this is a bit of a bugbear of mine. When people say Diamond 9, I
Yeah.
get slight PTSD. I just want to recommend, I don't think anybody else is still doing this, but do you remember in the olden days that you literally had to cut out all the 9 things and then stick them onto your page into the Diamond
Yeah.
9? And kids, there are certain kids in your classes that have to cut them out perfectly, and it'll take them about 10 minutes to cut out.
Yeah.
Can I suggest you find ways, people listening, that you can do Diamond 9 without them having to cut? So even if you just number them 1 to 9, so you could give them all the ideas in a grid and they number it 1 to 9. And then you spend the time that they're saving cutting out on them justifying why they've put something as number 1.
Louisa,
Because the other thing is, sorry, go on, Joe.
I have a solution.
Okay.
I have a worksheet for this. It's like a outline of a diamond with, you got an outline of a diamond, then with 9 diamonds within it.
Yeah.
There'll be a technical term for that. But then you list the statements, so A, then give the statement, B, give the statement, C, give the statement. So they've got them there. They discuss them, and then they place the letter of the statement in the appropriate section of the diamond 9.
Yeah.
Saves on the cutting out, because I can't bear the idea of being by the guillotine for an hour.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Can't bear it. And so it saves hours.
Yeah.
I'll send it you.
Yeah. But also, I would say any situation where they don't have to write out the statement as well, because writing out 9 statements or cutting out 9 statements is just, there's no learning happening there. The other thing I'd say is they're quite often like trying to work out 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 2, 2, 1. And they can't quite fit it into that quite structured. Whereas if they're just naming them like numbering them 1 to 9, or they're, either way, really think about how you're using that activity to test what you need it to test, which is ranking ideas in terms of what's the strongest or the most convincing or the one that you agree with most, and spend the time analyzing metacognitively why they're making certain decisions. I think, it's that's my bugbear, but I think, we'll share maybe that sheet that you've got in the show notes so that people kind of find a sort of more efficient way of getting the same outcome. I think that's really important. Yeah, that was just my bugbear. I'll just about Diamond 9s.
Space to share.
Yeah. Now, one sort of element that sort of come into RE over the last sort of like 4 or 5 years is this idea of disciplinary knowledge. And this is the idea that you have the substance, you have the sort of substantive knowledge, the stuff you're trying to teach, but you will learn different things through different lenses depending on the type of knowledge. So if you are doing, a story from the Bible, then you're going to apply a theological lens. You're going to use hermeneutics. The types of tasks, the types of questions you're going to ask is different. If you are maybe looking at arguments for the existence of God, you're going to do that through a sort of philosophical lens. The types of questions you're going to ask are going to be different. And the same as if you're doing things through social sciences. Just talk to us about this, because I think it's really important that we change the style of our questioning depending on the discipline that we are using to teach that content. So just talk to us a little bit about how to do that.
Yeah, I think, building upon what you just said, it's about, the teacher's thinking, what is my disciplinary focus?
Yeah.
In this unit of work or in this lesson, and for me, theology is about hermeneutics. It's about, the origin of a belief, or how, what different ways in which a text could be interpreted, where its authority comes from. If it's a philosophical question, we're thinking about coherence of argument. We're looking at, how do people decide what's right and wrong, the quality of evidence provided. From a sociological perspective, we're looking at, differences in lived religious experience, and factors to do with like identity and how text may shape practice. And it all comes down to like the focus of your lesson, the focus of your unit of study. But I think they're really helpful because they allow us to frame substantive knowledge and concepts in really different ways and do different things with it. So, strictly, I gave four examples of beliefs or practice. One of them, original sin, a theological question about original sin. How is original sin understood in Christian theology? It's a great question. A philosophical question. Does original sin undermine the concept of free will and moral responsibility? Very substantive knowledge or concept, but it's thinking about it in a very different way. Then if we put a social science framing around that concept, how has the belief in original sin influenced social norms and morality? Yet again, it's getting students to think about ideas in a really different way. I'll just use one more example. If we take the pillar of Zakah, what is the theological significance of Zakah in purifying the soul? Big question there that will allow students to draw upon maybe passages from the Quran that they've looked at and link to other Islamic beliefs they may have studied. A philosophical question framed around it. Can obligatory moral acts lead to social justice? And then in a social science lens, how does the practice of zakah influence Muslim communities? And it's doing something really different in each of those disciplines. And we teach about those two concepts mentioned in GCSE, but it is pushing it beyond what
Yes.
they would be expected to know or write or think about within a GCSE classroom. And I think it really encourages that like deeper thinking and hopefully spark a wider range of more fruitful discussion in the classroom.
Actually, I think what's interesting is that the responses that those questions would elicit,
Mm.
allows them to answer GCSE style questions. So if
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
asking a social sciences question about how might this influence society, you'll have influence questions in the GCSE. If you're asking a theological question, that's going to help them do their questions where they have to look at sources of authority or have to do, their evaluation. And so actually I think what that does is it makes your GCSE lessons richer
Mm.
because you are getting the same information, but without that kind of formulaic way of doing things that you sometimes find at GCSE. But also, you can build those kind of questions into Key Stage 3 so that you are not making Key Stage 3 like Key Stage 4. You're not mimicking Key Stage 4 type questions,
Mm.
but you're building those skills
Yeah.
to them, which I think is really powerful. The other thing which I think is really interesting is, and it's sort of something you said at the beginning, that you might have a particular focus for a lens over a unit.
Mm.
So actually, you might have a theologically based unit. You might have a lesson that's got the focus of philosophy, but actually, you might have a topic that you do for a lesson, and then you look at it through the three different lenses.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's really important to think about if you've got a unit that's a theology sort of based unit, that your inquiry question, if you do that sort of thing, is a theological question. And so if you've got a lesson that's got a particular focus, the questions you're going to ask in that lesson are going to be theological questions. If you've got a lesson on a topic and you're looking through different lenses, your questions are going to change throughout the lesson depending on what lens you're going to come at that same information from. So I think it's just being mindful of that. I think that really will enhance not only your teaching but also the learning that's going on. We spoke earlier about that questioning is not just something that the teacher does, that actually in a good RE lesson, students should be asking questions of the teacher and students should be talking to each other and asking each other questions. What is a good question? And how do you teach students what good questions are?
I think if you're trying to get students to think about what makes a good question, you might have space within the classroom to explore with students, like what would be the success criteria for like a big question. And, often when we've looked at this in the classroom, it might involve a question that challenges us, it makes us think. A question that's about something that really matters. It's not just about, what's for lunch today. It's getting at something that's like at the heart of the heart of the human experience? Like, does it contain like a big concept or like a juicy idea? Is the question contestable? Is there going to be a plurality of views on in response to that question? And like, will it engage people? Not like engage like in a like, just get their attention, but is it one that is worthy of considering? And, if we discuss this as like a success criteria for a question, you then might give students a load of sample questions. They have to like, select the ones which best fit that criteria just to get them, thinking about that. In the classroom, if you wanted to give them opportunity to think of questions, it could be like in response to like a piece of scholarship. They've read an extract, I don't know, from a like Karen Armstrong book or something, or an extract from Peter Vardy. And it could be like, well, if you could ask the author one question, what based on the material, based on the material, not anything, based on the material. It could be like if we're looking at social science data and we've looked at like, YouGov survey on what people in the UK believe about God. The follow-up is, we could say, if you were to pose a follow-up question in this survey, what would it be and why? Or in like, a really traditional way, it could be like an exit ticket where students that write one question based on today's learning. You could then collate those answers, collate the questions and then look through them and think, and as you go through them, the teacher can think, are these questions which I need to explain, address? Are they questions which are worthy of classroom discussion? Are there questions which might reveal misconceptions that need to be addressed? So that might be a good way of getting students to not only write questions, but also questions that can inform further planning and teaching in the classroom. Right. Also as well, I think you can develop a questioning culture by like modeling and celebrating intellectual curiosity. Firstly, like as the teacher, often in the classroom, I might say like, oh, this question's really puzzled me, or, I often think about this question, or it might be that a student might ask a question in a lesson and I genuinely might not know the answer, or I'm unsure myself. And I might say, I'm going to find out about that for next lesson. I'm going to bluff an explanation, but it shows to the students that intellectual curiosity is something that's ongoing. Also, as well, the times when they do ask questions, like without going over the top, like make a deal of praising their, oh, that's a great question. I never thought about it that way. So you're praising thoughtful and challenging questions. You could have like a wonder wall of questions that students, could stick on post-it notes. Just finding like lots of opportunities to model your own intellectual curiosity, the intellectual curiosity of students, and give them opportunities to think about what a good question is, and and model what a good question is, and think of their own where possible.
Yeah. Gosh, there's lots there. So the sort of first thing I heard from you is that you almost have to teach the students what a good question is, and you need to give them a criteria of what a good question is, and you need to model it. And so I'm thinking if you do that sort of quite early on in your year or in your school, sort of lower down the school, so you can then build on it as it goes through. Because actually that's one way that we get better at RE is we ask better questions. So I think that's really powerful. I think creating space for that in your lesson. So creating space for students to ask questions, and whether that is like an exit ticket, because that's quite a good way of containing it. Because if you have too much space for questions, no learning will happen. So actually that's quite a good way of kind of containing that questioning. I think modeling that is really good. So, and I think this is something that we often find difficult as teachers, is that intellectual humility. And so we have to know what a good question is. And actually, we sometimes have to not answer the question.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we take that step and go, wow, that's a really, really good question. And it almost goes back to that metacognition. Why is that a great question? That's brilliant. That's why it's a good question. Right. What are people's thoughts? What do people think about this question? And then you can ask questions to help them answer their own question.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't always have to be you answering their questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because actually that's, sometimes it is if no one has any thoughts or opinions, and you might go, well, what about this answer? So I think that's interesting. So telling them what a good question is, giving them a criteria, modeling it, modeling intellectual curiosity, creating space for questions. I think these are all really powerful things. So is there anything else you feel you want to say about questioning that you haven't felt, or that you've haven't had the opportunity to say, or maybe just a kind of final thought you want to leave listeners with?
I think if anything I've not covered, I think with questioning, I think often we take it for granted because we see it as just part and parcel of the job.
Mm,
And I often think that the meat and potatoes of the job, the stuff that we think about, the stuff that we do without thinking about it, or the stuff that happens on the day to day, the beating heartbeat of the classroom, that's the stuff that I think we need to spend the most time on
yeah,
and really think about how can I get better at this? How can
yeah,
I try something that I've not considered before? How can I get more students thinking? How can I up the participation ratio in my classroom? And I think, really breaking down the molecular and the minutiae of questioning, I think can really help to elevate our own practice as teachers, but also ultimately, it comes back to the students. It boosts their achievement. It boosts their belonging in the classroom, and it boosts their experience of our subjects and all their other subjects. Because it's not just something for RE teachers. It's all classroom teachers. We are all professional question askers.
yeah. And one thing I would just add to that is just find the power of I don't know.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, particularly those that are quite new to teaching, feel
Mm,
that they should know answers or they don't feel confident to say,
yeah.
I don't know. I think one of the most powerful things we can do is model ignorance. Actually,
Yeah.
you're right. I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Where do you think would be a good place to go and find that information?
Yeah.
You know,
And often, I think about times in my career where a student's asked a question where I don't know the answer. I bluff it, they'll
yes,
they'll know. And it does take a lot of experience and also confidence in your own abilities, but
yeah,
also confidence in your own abilities and the recognition that actually my intellectual honesty, I don't know, but I'm going to find out,
yes,
will actually boost your relationship with the class more
yeah,
so than if you bluffed it.
yeah, 100%.
More so than if you bluffed it, because if they see that you're just human like them and we
Yeah,
don't know everything, and I think that boosts that shows to the students that, learning is a lifelong thing, and intellectual curiosity is a lifelong thing, and it's okay to not know everything.
yeah,
And I think that's a really helpful thing for students to see, but also just for other teachers to acknowledge and practice themselves,
yeah.
because you could teach the same lesson for 10 years, but occasionally you'll get a question you're like, well, I've never had that one before.
No,
Never
yeah,
had that. Never had that before. Or I don't know how I've said this and I've got that question. It will happen.
yeah.
There's a great comfort in saying, I don't know, but I'm going to find out.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And the other thing I'd say is just when you're recognizing that students are using questions to derail the lesson,
Uh,
for me, what I'll always do is go, that is such an interesting question. It's not the focus of today's lesson, but if you're interested, stay behind at the end of the lesson and I'll talk to you about it at break.
yeah, that's a great response.
Because then 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, they won't stay. But actually, it
Yeah,
gives the opportunity to ask that question if it is genuine curiosity. So you're not
yeah,
shutting it down, you're just moving it to an appropriate place so it's not used to, like, derail
yeah.
the lesson.
Sometimes a kid will ask really good questions. I'm like, wow, they're really engaged with this. And we'll have a bit of a dialogue, and then They'll see them clock the clock, emotionally distraught. They've been, manipulating my enthusiasm for
Yeah.
the subject to their
Yeah,
own
yeah,
means.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just about knowing the student, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if they're about to do some written work and then they suddenly start asking loads of questions. You're like, hang on a minute. You're trying to avoid doing any
I'm a
writing.
period 5 as well.
Yeah. So, Joe, I really appreciate this. I think this is so helpful. I think obviously listening to this episode is a really great start to kind of, looking at your own questioning practice. Reading the chapter on your book is another really good place to go to kind of consolidate a lot of what we're saying. Is there anything else that you've read when you were writing the book that you kind of would then signpost to people if they want to go that one step further?
Yeah, I think There's a book by Michael Childs called Powerful Questioning, which is really
Yes.
good on like the research behind questioning. And I think the book provides a really great range of strategies for developing our skills as questioners and really promoting that questioning culture that we want. So I recommend that. There's another book by Craig Barton called Tips for Teachers, and there's loads of great tips in there just on questioning. Like I said before, like really breaking it down to the molecular level of, different ways of trialing cold call and different ways of dealing with I don't know. So there's lots of great stuff in there. Also, the walkthrough series by Tom Sherrington and Oliver Cabiglioli is great. Lots of techniques in there on questioning, which are broken down into 5 steps. I think they're really helpful if you wanted to try something in your own classroom and just have some key steps to bear in mind when you're trialing stuff. So I'd recommend those 3 books.
Brilliant. We'll put those a link to those in the show notes so people can have a look at that if that's something that they want to develop. Joe, thank you so much as ever for just giving really practical, clear advice on something that's going to really transform our classrooms, build on the great stuff that we're already doing. And actually, the reality of what we're always trying to achieve is just high quality RE
Mm.
lessons so that students can really engage with, what, as we said at the beginning, what is essentially who we are as humans, which is to ask questions and to ask big questions and to discover who we are and our place in the world. So I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. A pleasure as always. Really enjoyed it.
Brilliant. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE podcast. The podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, but it's not. It gets to the very heart of who we are as humans and our curiosity and our development and evolution as a species. But thank you so much for letting us bore the life out of you. Brilliant.